Morning, folks. This morning we come to look at verse 15 of Philippians chapter 2. We were thinking about the fact that as Christians, we are to be different from unbelievers in the way we live, working out our salvation, living like lights shining in the darkness. But it isn't enough for us to be different from unbelievers. We as Christians are to be concerned for unbelievers. Godly living is certainly important, there's no doubt about that. But also, we are to be evangelistically active, taking the good news of the gospel to those around us. Now, here Paul speaks about the gospel and he describes it as the word of life. Why does he use that term? Why does he not just simply say, holding forth the gospel? Let me suggest a few reasons. We'll look at one of them this morning. First of all, the gospel is described as the word of life because it highlights the sinner's need of spiritual life. Paul has just been speaking about the contrast that exists between the life of the Philippian Christians and the life of their fellow citizens. And in the analogy that he uses, he talks about light and darkness, the light shining in amidst the darkness of the black sky. He goes on now to talk to them about holding forth the word of life, and it seems as though he's bringing another contrast in here, the contrast between life on the one hand and death on the other. Paul knew that in spiritual terms, the believers to whom he was writing were spiritually alive. And the way in which they evidenced the reality of that was by the way they lived. But here's the point. All around them were men and women and young people who, as their lives clearly demonstrated, were spiritually dead. The message of the gospel is the word of life. And it's the word of life because it begins where we must always begin, by telling sinners that they are not alive, not in the true sense of the word. Because true life consists of experiencing and enjoying fellowship with God. And that is something that by nature, unsaved people do not possess. You see, the message of the gospel, message about life, takes the sinner by the hand and walks him back, as it were, into the Garden of Eden, and he shows that sinner how our first parents, Adam and Eve, sinned against God, and as a result of their disobedience, they were punished and they lost that wonderful fellowship with God that they once possessed. God said, "You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die." And when they ate of the forbidden fruit, yes, they continued to live physically for many years after they actually sinned. Eventually, of course, they did die. But at that very moment, their sin caused them to die spiritually. Their relationship with God was not what it used to be. It was broken. And the sinner must be told that he is dead spiritually. Paul teaches in Romans 5 that as a result of Adam having sinned, all of us are counted as sinners before God. He says, by one man sin entered the world, and death by sin, so death has passed upon all men, for all have sinned. And the message of the gospel makes this clear, and it also makes it clear that the consequences of sin not only involve a severance in our relationship with God, bad enough as that is, but they also bring us under the wrath of God. We are enemies of God. This is what Paul is talking about in Ephesians chapter 2. He says, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. And he goes on to say, and by nature you were objects of wrath. And the message of the gospel, the word of life, as Paul describes it here in Philippians chapter 2, is that man must realize he is not alive, that he is dead in sin. But it doesn't finish with that message, of course. The word of life goes on to speak of the possibility of experiencing real life, spiritual life, of enjoying eternal life. And eternal life doesn't mean unending existence, that's part of it, but it's much bigger than that. Eternal life is entering into life in all its fullness, lived in fellowship with God. And the gospel message highlights this. This is man's need. He needs true life again. So that's one reason why Paul describes the gospel as the word of life. It highlights the fact that when we're sinners, we're dead. But it goes on to speak of the wonderful prospect of true life. And it's our job to bring this message to the unsaved. May God help us as we think about these things throughout today. Have a good day.